That Friday afternoon changed everything. I can still feel the weight of that moment, sitting in our cramped Chicago office, watching Claire fall apart at her desk. I thought I was being a good colleague. I thought I was showing loyalty. God, I was so naive. Claire took my help, my late nights, my genuine care for her success, and she twisted it into something ugly. She made me look like a threat, like someone who couldn't be trusted to stay in their lane. The woman I'd tried to save from embarrassment became the person who systematically destroyed my reputation and erased me from projects I'd built from the ground up. The betrayal didn't happen all at once. It was slow, calculated, deliberate. First, she planted seeds of doubt about my judgment. Then she isolated me from the team, making everyone believe I was a problem that needed to be managed. Finally, she took credit for my work while I sat there, silenced and powerless, watching my career crumble. But what happened after I lost everything? That's when I learned who I really was. And that's when I realized that sometimes the people who break you end up teaching you exactly what you need to know about trust, loyalty, and the kind of person you never want to become. I thought I was doing something good. Turns out, I was digging my own grave. It was one of those dreary Friday afternoons in downtown Chicago. The kind where the fluorescent lights in our cramped office felt like they were sucking the life out of everyone. I was sitting at my desk, nursing my third cup of coffee and watching the rain streak down the windows of our accounting firm when I noticed Claire pacing around her cubicle like a caged animal. Her usually perfect blonde hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she kept checking her phone every 30 seconds. The woman who normally had everything under control looked like she was about to lose it completely. I'd been working there for almost 2 years, and I'd never seen her so frazzled. She was always the one with the answers, the one who made everything look effortless. But that day, something was different. I could see the stack of papers on her desk from where I sat, and they seemed to be multiplying by the hour. The monthly client reports were due Monday morning, and from what I could tell, she was drowning in work. Our biggest client, Henderson Manufacturing, always demanded perfection in their financial presentations, and Claire was the one who usually handled their account. She'd been working late every night that week, and it showed in the dark circles under her eyes and the way she kept rubbing her temples. I remember thinking about how much pressure she must be under, especially since the partners had been breathing down everyone's necks about client retention. The economy wasn't great, and losing Henderson would be a disaster for the firm. The office was slowly emptying out as people headed home for the weekend, but Claire remained glued to her desk, frantically typing away at her computer. I finished up my own work and was about to pack up when I heard her let out a frustrated sigh that seemed to echo through the nearly empty office. That's when I made the decision that would change everything between us. I walked over to her cubicle and saw her staring at a half-finished presentation, her hands literally shaking as she tried to format a particularly complex financial chart. The Henderson account was worth more than $500,000 to our firm, and everyone knew that messing up their quarterly review could mean serious consequences. I had worked on similar presentations before, and I knew I could help her get it done right. "Hey, Claire, you look swamped," I said, trying to keep my voice casual and friendly. "I've got some experience with Henderson's reporting format from when I helped on their audit last year. Want me to take a look at the presentation and maybe clean up some of the formatting?" She looked up at me with those tired blue eyes, and for a moment I saw something that might have been relief cross her face. But it was gone so quickly that I almost thought I'd imagined it. She glanced around the office, making sure no one else was listening, then nodded curtly. "Yeah, okay. But don't change the content, just make it look presentable. I need to get this to the partners by Monday morning." Her voice was clipped, professional, like she was doing me a favor by letting me help rather than the other way around. I spent the next 4 hours at the office, working through dinner while Claire went home to get some rest. The presentation was actually in worse shape than I'd initially thought. The financial data was solid, but the formatting was inconsistent. Some of the charts were illegible, and there were several typos that would have made us look unprofessional in front of such an important client. I carefully went through each slide, making sure the fonts were uniform, The colors matched our company's branding guidelines, and all the numbers aligned properly. I even added some visual elements that I knew Henderson's CEO appreciated based on previous presentations I'd seen him respond well to. By the time I finished, it was almost midnight, and the security guard was making his rounds. I felt good about what I'd accomplished, thinking I'd saved Claire from a potentially embarrassing situation. I sent the completed presentation to Claire's email with a note that simply said, "Hope this helps. Have a great weekend." I didn't expect a response right away since it was so late, but I figured she'd appreciate having one less thing to worry about over the weekend. As I drove home through the empty streets of Chicago, I felt that warm feeling you get when you know you've done something good for someone. I was tired, hungry, and my back ached from hunching over the computer for so long, but I was satisfied. I thought about how relieved Claire would be when she saw the finished product, and how maybe this would strengthen our working relationship. We'd never been particularly close, but I respected her skills and thought this might be the beginning of a better professional friendship. Little did I know that my act of kindness was about to backfire in ways I never could have imagined. Sometimes the road to hell really is paved with good intentions, and I was about to learn that lesson the hard way. What I thought was helping a colleague in need was actually stepping into territory that would mark me as a threat in Claire's mind. But all of that was still to come, and for that brief moment driving home in the early morning hours, I felt like I'd done the right thing. The city lights blurred past my windshield, and I had no idea that my professional life was about to take a turn that would teach me more about human nature than I ever wanted to know. What started as a gesture of care turned into a reason for her to tear me down. Monday morning arrived with that crisp October chill that makes you want to stay in bed just a little longer. I got to the office early, feeling energized despite my late night on Friday. I was curious to see how the Henderson presentation had gone over with the partners, and I was looking forward to Claire thanking me for the help. Maybe we'd grab coffee together, and she'd tell me how relieved she was to have the formatting sorted out. I imagined us laughing about how stressed she'd been, and how good it felt to have a colleague who had her back. As I settled into my cubicle with my morning coffee, I kept glancing over at Claire's desk, waiting for her to arrive. When she finally walked in around 9:30, she looked refreshed and put together again, her hair perfectly styled and her usual confidence restored. But something was off. Instead of the grateful smile I was expecting, Claire barely acknowledged my presence. She sat down at her desk, opened her laptop, and started typing without so much as a glance in my direction. I figured maybe she was just focused on getting ready for the Henderson meeting, which was scheduled for 10 o'clock. I decided to give her some space and went about my own work, handling the monthly reconciliations for our smaller clients. The morning passed quietly, with the usual office sounds of keyboards clicking, phones ringing, and the occasional conversation by the water cooler. But there was a tension in the air that I couldn't quite put my finger on, like the moment before a thunderstorm when everything feels charged and waiting. Around 11:30, I noticed Claire walking back from the conference room, where the Henderson meeting had taken place. She was with two of the partners, Mr. Davidson and Mrs. Rodriguez, and they seemed to be having an intense conversation near the break room. I tried not to eavesdrop, but their voices carried across the open office space. That's when I heard Claire say something that made my stomach drop. I had to spend most of Sunday fixing a presentation that someone had completely reformatted without my knowledge. It threw off my whole preparation for the meeting. The way she said, "Someone made it clear she was talking about me," even though she didn't mention my name directly. The partners nodded sympathetically, and I heard Mr. Davidson say something about communication protocols and maintaining chain of command. The rest of that conversation was a blur, but the message was crystal clear. Somehow, my attempt to help had been twisted into something problematic. I sat at my desk, staring at my computer screen, but not really seeing anything, trying to process what had just happened. Had I overstepped by reformatting the presentation? I thought back to Friday night, remembering how grateful Claire had seemed when I offered to help. Had I misread the situation entirely? The more I thought about it, the more confused I became. The presentation had looked professional and polished when I sent it to her, What could have been wrong with it that required her to spend Sunday fixing it? And why hadn't she called me if there were issues instead of complaining to the partners about it? By lunchtime, I couldn't stand the uncertainty anymore. I walked over to Claire's desk, my heart pounding in my chest like I was about to confess to a crime. She looked up from her computer with an expression that was completely neutral, almost cold. "Claire, can we talk for a minute?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I heard you had some issues with the Henderson presentation, and I wanted to make sure everything was okay." She saved her work, closed her laptop, and stood up with deliberate slowness. "Sure," she said, her voice flat. "Let's go to the small conference room." As we walked across the office, I felt like everyone was watching us, though when I glanced around, most people seemed absorbed in their own work. Claire closed the conference room door behind us and turned to face me, her arms crossed over her chest. The room felt smaller than usual, with its single window overlooking the parking lot and the generic motivational posters on the walls. "You made me look completely unprepared," she said without any preamble. "I spent weeks working on that presentation, getting every detail exactly how Henderson likes it, and then you changed everything. The fonts, the colors, even some of the chart layouts. When I opened it Sunday morning, I barely recognized my own work." Her voice was controlled, but I could hear the anger underneath. "I had to spend hours undoing your changes and getting it back to the way it was supposed to be. Do you have any idea how that made me look in front of the partners?" I felt my face flushing with embarrassment and confusion. "Claire, I'm so sorry. I thought I was helping. The formatting seemed inconsistent, and I know Henderson likes things to look polished." She held up a hand to stop me. "That's exactly the problem. You thought you knew better than me about my own client. You took it upon yourself to fix something that wasn't broken. And now the partners think I can't handle my workload without someone else stepping in to save me." The words hit me like a physical blow. I had genuinely believed I was doing her a favor, but hearing it from her perspective, I could see how it might have looked presumptuous. Still, something about her reaction felt disproportionate to what had actually happened. "I never meant to undermine you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "If there was a problem with what I did, why didn't you just call me over the weekend? I would have been happy to change it back or help you fix whatever was wrong." Claire's expression didn't soften. "Because I shouldn't have to clean up after your good intentions. Next time, stay in your lane and let me handle my own responsibilities." The conversation was over before I could say anything else. She opened the conference room door and walked out, leaving me standing there feeling like I'd been slapped. The trust I thought we were building had not only disappeared, but had somehow turned into something resembling hostility, and I had no idea how to fix it. She made it seem like everything was fine, but behind my back, a different story was being told. The weeks following our confrontation in the conference room was strange and uncomfortable in ways I'd never experienced before. On the surface, Claire maintained a professional demeanor whenever we interacted directly. She'd nod politely when we passed in the hallway, respond to my emails when absolutely necessary, and even engage in small talk during team meetings. But underneath that veneer of normalcy, I could feel something shifting in the office dynamics. It was subtle at first, like when you notice the temperature dropping but can't quite pinpoint when it started getting cold. Other colleagues who used to chat with me regularly began keeping their conversations brief and businesslike. The easy camaraderie I'd enjoyed with people like Jake from IT and Maria from HR seemed to evaporate almost overnight. I first realized something was seriously wrong when I discovered I'd been removed from the Morrison Industries project without any advance notice. I'd been working on their quarterly tax filings for months, getting familiar with their complex corporate structure, and building a good rapport with their accounting team. Every Tuesday morning, I'd have a conference call with their CFO to go over any questions or concerns, and I'd been looking forward to presenting my analysis of their third quarter numbers. But when Tuesday rolled around, I noticed the meeting had disappeared from my calendar. Confused, I checked my email for any cancellation notices, but found nothing. It wasn't until I overheard Jake mentioning something about the Morrison call that I realized what had happened. "Hey Jake," I said, trying to keep my voice casual as I approached his cubicle. "Did you hear anything about the Morrison meeting being rescheduled?" He looked uncomfortable, shifting in his chair and avoiding eye contact. I think Rebecca is handling that account now. Claire mentioned something about reassigning it last week." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Rebecca was newer than me, still learning the ropes of our more complex clients. And Morrison Industries required someone with experience in multi-state tax compliance. I'd spent months developing expertise in their specific industry regulations. Why would Claire reassign such an important account without even discussing it with me first? I found Claire in the break room later that afternoon, stirring sugar into her coffee with more force than necessary. The fluorescent lights overhead made her blonde hair look almost white, and there were new lines around her eyes that I hadn't noticed before. "Claire, can I ask you about the Morrison account? I noticed Rebecca is taking over the quarterly call." She didn't look up from her coffee cup. I thought it would be good for Rebecca to get some experience with larger clients. "You can focus on some of our smaller accounts that need attention." Her tone was matter-of-fact, like she was discussing the weather, but something about the way she said it made me feel like I was being demoted rather than reassigned. "But I've been working with Morrison for 8 months, I pressed, trying not to sound desperate. "I know their books inside and out, and their CFO specifically requested to keep working with me on the compliance issues." Claire finally looked at me, and her expression was completely unreadable. "Sometimes it's good to have fresh eyes on an account. Rebecca will do fine." She walked past me toward the door, then paused and turned back. "Besides, you seem to have your hands full with your current workload. I wouldn't want you to feel overwhelmed." The comment was clearly a reference to the Henderson presentation incident, and the message was clear. I couldn't be trusted with important responsibilities. The isolation became more pronounced over the following weeks. I noticed that I was being excluded from planning meetings for projects I'd previously been involved in. When I asked Maria from HR about the monthly team lunch that I'd somehow missed, she gave me a sympathetic look and said, "Oh honey, I thought you knew it was cancelled." But later that day, I saw photos on the company's internal social media feed, showing most of my department enjoying lunch at that new Italian place downtown. Everyone was smiling and laughing, raising their glasses in some kind of toast, and I felt like I was looking at a party I'd never been invited to. The betrayal stung worse than any direct confrontation would have. What hurt the most was the gradual realization that my colleagues were starting to treat me differently. People who used to include me in their conversations began lowering their voices when I walked by. The easy banter I'd enjoyed during coffee breaks disappeared, replaced by polite but distant exchanges about work matters. I started eating lunch alone at my desk, telling myself it was more productive than sitting in the break room where conversations seemed to die whenever I appeared. The office felt like a completely different place than it had just a month earlier, and I was beginning to understand that Claire's version of our Henderson presentation conflict had become the official narrative. Whatever she'd told people about me had effectively painted me as someone who couldn't be trusted to stay within appropriate boundaries. The loneliness was suffocating. I'd go home each evening to my small apartment and replay the day's interactions, trying to figure out what I could have done differently. My cat Oliver would curl up on my lap while I sat on the couch, and I'd find myself talking to him about office politics like he could offer some kind of insight into human behavior. The isolation was making me question everything about myself, from my professional judgment to my ability to read social situations. I started wondering if maybe Claire was right, if I really had overstepped in ways I didn't understand. The uncertainty was eating away at my confidence, and I could feel myself becoming more withdrawn and second-guessing every decision I made at work. It wasn't enough to erase me. She needed everyone to believe I was a risk. The morning that changed everything started like any other Tuesday in November. The Chicago wind was howling outside our office building, making the windows rattle in their frames, and I was trying to focus on reconciling the accounts for Peterson Manufacturing when I got an email that made my blood run cold. The subject line read, "Schedule meeting performance discussion," and it was from Claire, copied to HR. My hand started trembling as I opened it. The message was brief and clinical. We need to discuss some concerns about your recent work performance and professional boundaries. Please meet me in conference room B at 2 o'clock today. HR will be present. I read it 3 times, each time hoping I'd misunderstood something, but the meaning was crystal clear. The hours between receiving that email and the actual meeting felt like torture. I couldn't concentrate on anything, my mind racing through every interaction I'd had with Claire and other colleagues over the past few weeks. What had I done that warranted involving HR? The Henderson presentation incident had been weeks ago, and I thought we'd moved past it. I kept checking my watch, watching the minutes crawl by with agonizing slowness. My stomach was in knots, and I barely touched the sandwich I'd brought for lunch. I found myself going to the bathroom every 30 minutes just to splash cold water on my face and try to calm my nerves. The worst part was not knowing what specific accusations I'd be facing. When 2 o'clock finally arrived, I walked to conference room B on shaking legs. Claire was already there, sitting across from Patricia Williams from HR, both of them with serious expressions and manila folders open in front of them. The conference room felt like an interrogation chamber, with its stark white walls and that horrible fluorescent lighting that made everyone look sickly. Patricia gestured for me to sit down, and I noticed she had a legal pad covered in handwritten notes. "Thank you for coming," she said in that carefully neutral tone that HR people master. "We wanted to discuss some concerns that have been brought to our attention regarding your work relationships and professional boundaries." Claire leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a tone I'd never heard from her before, cold and almost clinical. "We've received feedback that you've been having difficulty understanding appropriate workplace boundaries," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. The incident with the Henderson presentation was concerning, but there have been other issues as well. My heart sank as I realized this was much bigger than I'd anticipated. "What other issues?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Patricia consulted her notes and began reading from what sounded like a prepared list. "There have been reports of you inserting yourself into projects without proper authorization, making unilateral decisions about client materials, and creating uncomfortable dynamics with team members." I felt like I was in some kind of alternate reality, where everything I'd done was being twisted into something sinister. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I was trying to help with the Henderson presentation because Claire seemed overwhelmed. "I've never tried to insert myself into projects inappropriately." Claire's expression remained impassive as she responded. "That's exactly the problem. You assumed I needed help without being asked, and then you took it upon yourself to completely redesign client materials without any oversight. That shows a fundamental misunderstanding of professional hierarchy and boundaries." The way she said it made me feel like I was some kind of rogue employee who couldn't be trusted to follow basic protocols. Patricia took over the conversation, explaining that they were implementing what she called a professional development plan to help me better understand workplace expectations and appropriate collaboration methods. The plan involved weekly check-ins with Claire, mandatory training modules on professional communication, and a probationary period during which my work would be more closely monitored. Every word felt like another nail in the coffin of my career. "This is all documented in your personnel file," Patricia continued, "and we'll be tracking your progress closely over the next 90 days. The implication was clear: shape up or ship out. As the meeting continued, I felt increasingly disconnected from my own body, like I was watching this happen to someone else. They discussed specific examples of my supposed boundary issues, including times when I'd offered input during team meetings or volunteered to take on additional work. Every instance of what I thought was being helpful and collaborative was reframed as overstepping and inappropriate behavior. Claire mentioned that several team members had expressed discomfort with my tendency to insert myself into situations where I wasn't needed. I wanted to ask who these team members were and what specifically they'd said, but the way Patricia was taking notes made it clear that any questioning would be seen as defensive and problematic. When the meeting finally ended, I walked back to my desk feeling like everyone in the office was staring at me. I could barely focus on my computer screen. the numbers and spreadsheets blurring together as I tried to process what had just happened. My professional reputation had been systematically destroyed in the span of an hour, and there was nothing I could do about it. The worst part was the creeping suspicion that this had all been orchestrated from the beginning, that the Henderson presentation incident had simply provided Claire with the excuse she needed to paint me as a problem employee who needed to be managed and ultimately eliminated. They didn't shout, but they silenced me with every gesture. The professional development plan turned my daily work life into a carefully monitored prison. Every email I sent had to be copied to Claire for review. Every client interaction required her pre-approval. Every project I worked on came with detailed instructions about exactly what I was and wasn't allowed to do. It was humiliating in ways I'd never experienced before, like being treated as a child who couldn't be trusted with scissors. The worst part was how normal everyone else acted about it, like having a colleague on this kind of intensive supervision was just another day at the office. I felt invisible and hypervisible at the same time, ignored by my teammates but scrutinized by management with an intensity that made my skin crawl. 3 weeks into this nightmare, I discovered the final betrayal in the most casual way possible. I was updating the client database when I noticed that the Henderson manufacturing account had been completely reassigned to someone else. Not just the quarterly reports, but the entire relationship that I'd helped build over the past year and a half. All of my work notes, client preferences, and historical data had been transferred to Jessica, a relatively new hire who'd joined the firm just 6 months earlier. When I clicked on the account details, I saw that the transition had been completed the previous Friday, and the first quarterly review under new management was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Nobody had bothered to tell me. I sat there staring at my computer screen, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. Henderson Manufacturing wasn't just any client. They were the account I'd put the most effort into, the one where I'd developed real expertise in their industry's complex regulatory requirements. I'd worked late countless nights to master their reporting preferences, had built genuine relationships with their accounting team, and had even attended their annual conference to better understand their business model. Seeing all of that work transferred to someone else without so much as a conversation felt like watching someone else move into your house while you stood helplessly on the sidewalk. The meeting notification came later that same afternoon. Henderson's quarterly review was scheduled for 10 the next morning, and I wasn't on the invite list. I'd been preparing for this meeting for weeks before the whole professional development plan fiasco started, and I knew the client's books better than anyone else at the firm. Their third quarter had involved some complex merger activity that required careful analysis of tax implications across multiple jurisdictions. I'd spent hours researching precedent cases and consulting with specialists to make sure we gave them the best possible advice. But now I'd be sitting at my desk doing busy work while someone else presented my analysis to the client. When Tuesday morning arrived, I tried to focus on the small tasks that now made up my daily routine. Reviewing expense reports for minor clients, updating database entries, and reconciling petty cash accounts. The kind of work that a recent graduate might do in their first month on the job. I could hear voices coming from the main conference room where the Henderson meeting was taking place, and I recognized the laugh of their CFO, a man I'd spoken with dozens of times over the past year. At one point, I heard him ask a question about the merger analysis, and I knew exactly what he was referring to because I'd anticipated that concern weeks earlier. But instead of being in that room to provide the answer, I was sitting at my desk pretending to care about a $20 discrepancy in someone's lunch expenses. The meeting ran long, which wasn't unusual for Henderson since they always had detailed questions about their financial position. Around noon, I saw the group walking toward the elevator, and Henderson's CFO was shaking hands with Mr. Davidson and Claire. He looked satisfied with whatever he'd heard, and I felt a twisted pride knowing that my work had probably contributed to that satisfaction, even though I'd get no credit for it. As they waited for the elevator, I heard the CFO tell Claire, "Great presentation today. Really thorough analysis of the merger implications." Claire smiled and thanked him, accepting praise for work she'd never even seen until I'd been removed from the project. After Henderson's team left, Claire walked past my desk without acknowledging me, carrying the folder that contained months of my research and analysis. She seemed energized and confident, like someone who'd just successfully closed an important deal. Later that afternoon, I overheard her on a phone call with one of the partners, discussing how smoothly the Henderson meeting had gone and how pleased the client seemed with the firm's handling of their account. She spoke with the authority of someone who'd managed the relationship from the beginning, making strategic decisions and building trust with an important client. There was no mention of transition challenges or learning curves, no acknowledgement that someone else had laid the groundwork for her success. That evening, as I sat in my car in the parking garage before driving home, I finally allowed myself to cry. Not the angry tears I'd been holding back for weeks, but the deep, exhausted sobs of someone who'd finally accepted that they'd been completely erased from a situation they'd helped create. My voice had been systematically removed from every conversation that mattered. My expertise had been transferred to others without recognition, and my professional identity had been reduced to someone who needed constant supervision to avoid causing problems. The betrayal was complete, and I knew there was no coming back from it. After being silent for so long, I finally started to understand what had really happened. The end came not with drama or confrontation, but with the quiet efficiency of a corporate machine that had decided I was no longer useful. 2 weeks after the Henderson meeting that I'd been excluded from, Patricia from HR called me into her office for what she described as a final evaluation of my professional development plan. I knew before I even sat down that this was going to be my termination meeting. The manila folder on her desk was thicker than before, and Claire was conspicuously absent from what should have been a joint review of my progress. Patricia spoke in the same carefully neutral tone she'd used throughout this entire ordeal, explaining that while I'd shown some improvement in following protocols, the firm had decided that my position was being eliminated due to restructuring. The official reason was budget cuts and departmental reorganization, but we both knew the truth. I was being let go because I'd become inconvenient, a reminder of Claire's moment of weakness when she'd needed help and had to accept it from someone she saw as beneath her. The severance package was generous enough to avoid any legal complications, and Patricia made it clear that the firm would provide positive references as long as I signed the non-disclosure agreement that prohibited me from discussing the circumstances of my departure. I signed everything they put in front of me, not because I agreed with their version of events, but because I was tired of fighting a battle I'd never had a fair chance of winning. Cleaning out my desk was surreal. 2 years of my professional life fit into a single cardboard box. A few personal photos, my coffee mug with the chip on the handle, some reference books I'd bought with my own money, and a small succulent plant that had somehow survived the fluorescent lighting. Claire was conveniently in meetings all day, avoiding any awkward farewell conversations. A few colleagues stopped by to say goodbye, but their words felt hollow and obligatory. Jake from IT seemed genuinely sorry to see me go, but even he couldn't quite meet my eyes when he shook my hand. The whole experience felt like attending my own funeral, while still being alive to see how few people actually cared. The months that followed were the darkest period of my adult life. I told myself I was taking time to regroup and plan my next career move, but the truth was that I was struggling with a level of self-doubt I'd never experienced before. Every job application felt like an exercise in fiction, trying to explain a gap in employment without revealing that I'd been systematically destroyed by a colleague who saw my helpfulness as a threat. I went through my savings faster than I'd expected, cutting back on everything from restaurant meals to my gym membership. The isolation I'd felt at the office was nothing compared to the loneliness of being unemployed in a city, where most of my social connections had been tied to work. It took almost a year before I could look back on the situation with any kind of clarity. I was working at a smaller firm by then, making less money but feeling more valued. When I ran into Maria from my old company at a coffee shop downtown, she seemed genuinely happy to see me and asked how I was doing. Over lattes and awkward small talk, she mentioned that Claire had been promoted to senior manager just a few months after I'd left. She really stepped up after you guys lost that big Henderson account, Maria said innocently. Apparently, the client wasn't happy with the transition and ended up switching firms. The irony was almost funny. The account Claire had stolen from me had ended up leaving anyway, taking their $500,000 annual fee with them. That conversation was the turning point that helped me understand what had really happened. Claire hadn't destroyed my reputation because I'd done something wrong. She'd done it because I'd accidentally exposed her vulnerability at exactly the wrong moment. My offer to help with the Henderson presentation had reminded everyone, including herself, that she wasn't as indispensable as she wanted to believe. Rather than acknowledge that even competent people sometimes need assistance, she'd chosen to eliminate the witness to her moment of weakness. It wasn't personal, although it had felt deeply personal at the time. It was just someone protecting their position by removing a perceived threat, regardless of the human cost. The hardest lesson was accepting that some people will always see collaboration as competition and kindness as weakness. I'd grown up believing that helping others was inherently good, that working together made everyone stronger, and that professional relationships could be built on mutual respect and support. Claire had taught me that those beliefs, while not wrong, were naive in environments where insecurity and ambition override basic human decency. I learned to be more careful about when and how I offered help, more observant about the motivations behind people's actions, and more protective of my own professional interests. It wasn't cynicism. It was wisdom earned through painful experience. Looking back now, I can honestly say that being betrayed by Claire was one of the most valuable experiences of my career, even though it nearly destroyed my confidence at the time. It taught me to recognize toxic workplace dynamics before they could harm me, to document my contributions more carefully, and to build relationships based on genuine trust rather than professional convenience. Most importantly, it showed me that surviving betrayal doesn't make you bitter. It makes you stronger and more discerning. The scars from that experience serve as reminders not to avoid taking risks or helping others, but to choose more carefully who deserves my trust and loyalty. Sometimes the most painful lessons are the ones that prepare you for a better future, even when you can't see it at the time. What's your story? Have you experienced betrayal in your workplace that taught you hard lessons about trust and loyalty? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this resonated with you, subscribe and hit that notification bell. There's so much more to explore about navigating difficult workplace relationships, building genuine professional connections, and turning painful experiences into wisdom that actually serves you. Remember, the goal isn't to avoid getting hurt. It's to learn how to heal stronger and choose better next time.